I'm being called a racist, a denialist, all these things. And I feel like this has become a game that gets played. As soon as you say something that goes against what everybody wants to be the accepted version, then you just get called names. And these ad hominem attacks are terrible. And they're making politicians afraid to speak truth about things that really have to be based on truth.
BC Conservative MLA Dallas Brody has been under fire for days now, not just by her NDP political opponents or the legacy media that parrots their opinions, but by some within her own caucus for, drum roll, advocating for truth in the legal system. That is, the truth about the false 2021 claim that the remains of 215 children were discovered in unmarked graves at the former Kamloops Indian Residential School. I'm Drea Humphrey with Rebel News, and recently I sat down to interview MLA Brody to hear how she's been coping with the ongoing backlash vilifying her as a residential school denialist, and why, despite it, she's not backing down.
It's about the truth coming out, and it's about, truly honoring those children.
For the Tecumlip's-Teshukapik First Nation, there were always suspicions. But with new ground-penetrating radar, the Interior BC First Nation says they have discovered in an unmarked grave the remains of 215 children.
No, they didn't. That's not true. But here we are, nearly 4 years, 0 bodies, and millions of tax dollars spent later. And if you say it ain't so, well, you may be labeled a residential school denier, like Vancouver Quilchena MLA Dallas Brody has been labeled for days now. Now, I'll get to Brody's interview with her side of the story, but first, I think it's really important I provide some context to where this backlash is coming from, since, the mainstream media is never going to do that for you. When someone talks smack about someone without naming them in the room, but everyone around knows exactly who they're talking about? Well, that's pretty much what some of Brody's own colleagues are publicly doing to her. Exhibit A, Chilliwack Cultus Lake MLA Aaliyah Warbus, who is also the party's House leader, took to X with this post saying, "Inform yourself, get the latest facts, research, and talk to survivors. Questioning the narratives of people who lived and survived these atrocities is nothing but harmful and taking us backward in reconciliation." In other words, MLA Warbus believes that there are certain narratives and millions of dollars that go along with it from the taxpayers that are above scrutiny. Her post, slapping back at her colleague, who's smeared as a residential school denialist, is over Brody's X post that makes it clear that contrary to popular and widespread misinformation, not a single body has actually been discovered at the former Kamloops Indian Residential School. Along with Warbus's statement of condemnation, she linked a 2023 article from the National Observer article, which discusses how an investigation into unmarked graves and missing children by British Columbia's Stolo Nation has revealed that at least 158 deaths, most of them at a hospital. Now, to be clear, the deaths occurred over a span of a lot of years and across 4 different institutions. And while the article doesn't specify this, the vast majority of the deaths that they're talking about took place inside of an Indigenous hospital. And make no mistake, these are tragic deaths. We're talking about children and youth. But the article does correctly point out that these children and youth, mostly in large, died from diseases like tuberculosis. Which you better be careful who you share that truth with, or else you'll end up like Jim McMurtry, the Abbotsford High School teacher who was marched out of his classroom in 2021 after the false claim because he, who by the way is also a history teacher, had the audacity to tell the kids who were traumatized by the claim that if it was true, most of the children likely died from diseases like that, not from some mass murder. But what's strange about Warbus's post with that article is that her colleague Dallas Brody, who she thinks needs to be more educated, never refuted or denied anything that's written in that article that she shared. Instead, Brody, a former attorney's post, addressed a specific and rather concerning issue of today that directly falls under her duty as the BC Conservatives' critic to the Attorney General, a duty to advocate for fair and effective legal systems in the province. Her tweet thread begins with this: "The number of confirmed child burials at the former Kamloops Indian residential school site is zero. Zero. No one should be afraid of the truth, not lawyers, their governing bodies, or anyone else." And that post was in response to this National Post article, which discusses the libel suit brought on by criminal defense lawyer in BC, Jim Heller, who alleges that the Law Society of BC acted in bad faith, high-handedness, arrogance, malice, and betrayed its ethical duties after he, too, was vilified as a residential school denier for simply bringing forth a resolution to have the Society's mandatory training for its members stop incorrectly teaching lawyers that an unmarked burial site containing the bodies of 215 children had been discovered at the former KIR school. And instead, he wanted them to use the more accurate potential unmarked burial site terminology, which, along with saying anomalies, is the same language the Kamloops band itself is now quietly backpedaled into using today. But who cares about facts, right? Especially if some liberal tears may shed over them. After all, it is good news that the nation hasn't found 200 or 215 dead Indigenous kids in some nefarious grave, isn't it? But apparently not to Brody's other colleague, Kamloops North MLA Peter Millibar. You can see that both Aaliyah Warbus and CKN radio host Jazz Johal took to X to high-five Millibar after he went after Brody, this time in the legislature.
A very respected former Cookbee, Manny Jules, who I've considered a friend for many years now, point blank asked me when I was at the podium in front of everyone and said, "What will you do in the face of denialism? What will you do in the chamber? Will you be our voice to push back against that?" And I flat out said, yes, I absolutely would.
So he admits to being a speaking piece for residential school denialism, which we now know has little to do with actually denying residential schools or the bad things that happen to them, and everything to do with challenging any politically correct narrative about them instead. Now, I wonder if Millibar has ever taken the opportunity to ask about why Kamloops, their band, didn't take the near $8 million we gave them to help them find the truth about what's underneath the ground to, I don't know, excavate? You know, like the other three nations we are aware of who did do that and ended up finding that the oral testimonies and the GPR had led them astray, which again is a good thing, right? But don't question the narrative, especially if it's one believed by an Indigenous person. And especially not the narratives handed out by the Union of BC Indigenous Chiefs, whose Grand Chief Stuart Phillip is saying this about Dallas Brody.
Their efforts to cover their reason for making these ugly, hurtful remarks is always free speech, attempting to get to the truth, but in reality, they're racist to the core.
Racist to the core? Now, where have I seen this union hurl such a slur before? Oh, that's right. Much like now, how the media keeps interviewing this union as though their opinions are reputable and safe. The BC Union of Indigenous Chiefs statements circulated a lot back in 2021, the year that the false 215 buried kids discovery claim was made and followed by a mass church burning spree that still hasn't ended today. Thanks to an order paper in question secured by Conservative MP Jamil Jivani, we now know that in that very same year that the Kamloops made that false claim, and the mainstream media, unlike myself, led the public to believe it was possible to prove that bodies were underground with something like GPR, a total of 90 churches were attacked by arson, 31 of which were intentionally burned in 2021 right here in BC. These hateful attacks on Christian communities were downplayed by leaders such as Prime Minister Trudeau, who, remember, responded by saying he understood the anger against the Catholic Church, and also by the then head of the BC Civil Liberties Association. Remember Harsha Walia, who shared info of a burning church with the caption, "Burn it all down" on it. And you know what the Union of BC Indigenous Chiefs had to say about that? They said they fully support Harsha Walia after her "burn it all down" tweet. And much like they're labeling Brody a racist today, they labeled any criticism against Harsha Walia's anti-Christian and pro-violence tweet as racist, misogynist, and part of an alt-right agenda. Talk about taking Canadians further away from truth and reconciliation. I tried to reach out to both MLA Millibar and Warbus to see if they would agree to speak with me or comment for you. I did get a response from Warbot's office claiming that despite her clearly having enough time to weigh in on this on social media, her schedule was too full to answer my questions for you. So I let the office know that's okay. I'll just try to catch her at a good time during the Conservatives' annual general meeting, which I've been covering for you at bcleadershipreports.ca. And to that, well, I was ghosted. In fact, I don't even think Miss Warbus was there. I looked for her and couldn't see her. But you should know that the leader of the Conservative Party of British Columbia, John Rustad, actually asked Dallas Brody to take her post down. And I did get a response from him about that and more. So make sure you watch to the end of this video to hear that. Here's Dallas Brody's side of the story.
Well, the decision to post this tweet was about a case that's been brought against the Law Society of British Columbia by a BC lawyer named Jim Heller. He is suing the Law Society of BC for defamation, and in my understanding, this has never happened before. And it involves a continuing legal education course that's required by the Law Society of BC now. The course involves training lawyers about sensitivity to Indigenous issues and understanding how the law impacts that. And he had taken the course and wanted a change to some wording within the course. And I felt that it was an important issue to look at.
Well, I have interviewed Mr. Jim Heller, and you're right, it's absolutely an important issue, a fitting one for you as the critic. We've gone over how your statement was fact-based, yet there are people, including some of your own colleagues, coming out against you, basically accusing you of denialism and denying historical truths and opportunities for justice. What do you make of your own colleagues taking that stance?
Well, we certainly have a diversity of views in our caucus, there's no question. I was surprised somewhat by this happening, but I've also accepted it, and I understand that my view of this is that this lawyer is seeking the addition of essentially one word to the course curriculum, which basically preambles the word burial sites with the word potential or possible. And even that minor request as a change to the curriculum was basically rejected out of hand by the Law Society. In terms of having my colleagues unhappy with my posts, well, I guess that's just the way it is. And I don't know what else I can say about it.
One of the things that's happened since this claim has gone out, in that year alone, we saw 91 churches be burnt or vandalized, many of which there was evidence to suggest that it was linked to the claim. And we have really had no politicians come out with what I call the good news. The good news is that there is no proof that there are 215 children's remains underground. Can you speak to why you think so many politicians are so silent about that when potentially it could relieve some of the tensions in many cases?
Well, I think this is a really excellent question because it is super important that if we are predicating national policies, legislation, programs, everything on the basis of something like 215 unmarked graves, then it better be true. And I guess the reason that nobody wants to come out and say, you know what, maybe initially they thought it was true, but now we know it's not true. I think it's because when you look what's happened to me, I say this and you get just deluged with horrible name calling, like terrible. I'm being called a racist, a denialist, all these things. And, you know, I feel like this has become a game that gets played. As soon as you say something that goes against what everybody wants to be the accepted version, then you just get called names. And these ad hominem attacks are terrible. And they're making politicians afraid to speak truth about things that really have to be based on truth. It's not just about feelings. Feelings matter. Everybody knows that there was deep harm done by the residential school system. I don't think there's a Canadian who thinks that it was a good thing. It's impossible. It's not in my heart. It's not in your. Nobody thinks that it was a great thing. But this is not a true story. And so we should just say that and relieve the tension. That's correct. And I think in terms of the churches that were burned down, I can't believe that charges haven't been pursued in this. I mean, this is terrible for our country. Churches, that's a lot of churches.
It's a lot of churches, a lot of church communities, a lot of Indigenous church communities. I'll just throw to a quick clip here of a man on a reserve who was just grieving one of the churches that were burnt after that false claim was made.
I loved it. And I don't like seeing it all pile of crap. I hope they rebuild or do something. Man, everyone got married and buried in that church. Everybody.
So what's your response to some BC Conservatives who might be concerned about the stance that Mr. Rustad took?
I can say yes. John asked me to take the post down, and we had a talk about it, and I wasn't going to take it down. So John and I talked about it, and he's decided to he's not clipping my wings. I have the right to speak, as do other MLAs, and they are speaking their minds. And this is going to make John's job harder when there are so many different viewpoints in our party. But he's standing by his word, which he said from the very beginning, that he will let people speak. And I respect him for that. And I think he also respects me for my position, and he understands why I feel strongly about what I'm doing here. Does he disagree with me? Yes, but we're both okay with that. His statements about what's happened and mine can coexist without contradicting one another. And that of all places where we need to be dealing in truth and not feelings or anything other than facts and evidence is at the Law Society of British Columbia. It's very, very important. If you went to court and you found out that the trier of fact you had was going to take into account things that weren't even evidence or proven facts, how would you feel about that? You don't have a hope for your case. The whole system we have of justice has been founded upon, a fact-seeking mission through the adversarial system of justice. It's not the perfect system, but it works the best. Many different systems have been tried, but we need to have truth in cases like this. And now here we are with a lawsuit coming from a BC lawyer whose life has been turned upside down by this himself. He's been called terrible names, all for asking for one word to be added to a curriculum. And he's correct in asking for that change. So it's too bad that it's gone this far, but here we are.
Some of you recall it wasn't too long ago since John Rustad was told to remove a tweet on his feed by his former leader Kevin Falcon with the BC Liberal Party. Well, that was the name at the time. Now, much like Brody, Rustad held his ground and refused to take the post down. So when I asked him about why he would then go and ask Brody to remove her post, he said the following. He said he asked Brody to take down the tweet because it could be misinterpreted. Some simple changes could have been made to avoid misinterpretation. At no point did I suggest that MLA Brody should have to leave caucus. He added that posting factual information should always be the goal of any politician. There is a very important distinction between what you say and how you say it. And when I asked about what his response is to the appearance that he could be pandering to the woke lefties like the Union of BC's Indigenous Chief, who have extreme views on what is racism and residential school denialism, he said anyone who tries to make that argument is doing so for political reasons. I have spoken out several times about the churches, the burnings, asking for a full investigation into the burning of churches. If I haven't already, I would certainly condemn Harsha Walia's comments. Drea Humphrey with Rebel News. At Rebel News, we don't back down from bringing you the other side of the story, and that's why we have my investigative documentary that proved that the 215 discovery claim was false around the year anniversary of the claim, available for you for free. You can go to our special website called kamloopsdocumentary.com and share it far and wide. And if you have it in you, please consider donating to chip in to cover the costs it takes for us to bring the truth to you.